Hi, everyone. Wow, what an amazing conversation by Steve Neekum and with Paul. That was absolutely amazing. So I hope you're all there. I'm just going to play the video about the community rights for all of you who may be jumping on.
Did you know it's illegal for local governments to pass laws that protect their communities from controversial corporate activities like oil pipelines, fracking, clear-cut logging?
You know that corporations have more constitutionally protected than people do?
Enter the community rights movement.
Since 1999, 200 towns, cities, and counties in 9 states have passed locally enforceable laws that ban specific harmful corporate activities and put decision-making back in the hands of local people.
We want to bring this incredibly successful community strategy to every community in this country.
We assembled an amazing network of people and organizations to provide communities with the support, training they need to run successful community campaigns.
Our work transcends conventional single-issue activism. We think of it as a rights-based strategy, which allows progressives and conservatives to have a much easier time coming together to protect the health, safety, and welfare of residents and the local environment. Community rights lawmaking can protect our right to clean water and safe food, our right to free and fair elections, our right to living wage jobs, and our right to a renewable energy future.
But this movement is more than just claiming lawmaking. It is also about catalyzing a profound culture shift.
The possibilities in your community, if more and more of your neighbors and coworkers within themselves are taking an active role in governance of their own communities.
We are, in fact, we the people. That is where our ultimate power and authority resides.
Your contribution will greatly expand the reach of the community movement.
Thank you for your support and for sharing our fundraising campaign with others.
Great. Well, hopefully we're back and you can hear me all right. Go ahead and just maybe put in the chat box if you are getting this streaming through. Then I know you're out there and you're listening, and that would be really great. Loud and clear. Great. Well, I can hear myself too, so I'm going to see if I can just pull down my audio. Great. All right. Well, hopefully you can still hear me. I'm Rivera Sun. I'm an author and an activist, and I am a big supporter of community rights. I am so excited to be here, to be helping out with this fundraiser. I really believe that what you are doing with these community rights is some of the most revolutionary, democratic, important work that has been going on in this country for a long, long time. So as Paul was saying earlier today, this is a fundraiser. Anything you can pitch in helps a lot of amazing work happen. So if it's $1 today, that's great. If it's $1 million today, well, thank you. We're glad you gave it to us and not to the corporations. So I am the author of a little book called The Dandelion Insurrection. If you've ever heard of this book, if you've ever read this book, maybe put it in the chat box so I know if you've been enjoying my writing. But there's a little secret in the Dandelion Insurrection, and that is that community rights show up on page 125. And here's the story of how they got into my book. So when I moved to Taos, New Mexico, which is where I live right now, I ran into a new friend, who lived in Mora County. Now, if you've ever been to New Mexico, you know there's a lot of big mountains. So to get from Taos to Mora, you have to drive over the mountains. But I heard that she and her community were trying to stop fracking from coming into this beautiful valley. It was once called the breadbasket of New Mexico. And so they were trying to use community rights in Mora County to stop the fracking from coming in, because like many of you who've been community rights supporters for a long time, they had found out that their community didn't have the legal right to protect their water, to protect their land, to protect their historic farms in the area. And so when they tried to find ways to stop the frackers from coming in, they found out that the state had rights, the federal government had rights, even the fracking corporation had rights, but they themselves did not have the right to say, this is bogus, this is wrong. We know that if you put chemicals into the ground, it's gonna come up in our water supply. So they were working on getting this community rights ordinance passed through the county government, and it was going to be the very first county in the United States to have passed community rights. But this county, there's 3 people on the county commission. It's tiny county, large area, small amount of people, and they needed a little moral support. So nearby Las Vegas, not where the casinos are, Las Vegas, New Mexico, beautiful town, wonderful place. They decided that they would pass a community rights ordinance to embolden the local area, to give Mora County courage to pass this community rights. So my partner and I, we got into our car. It was a blizzard of a day. I mean, snow flying left and right. We got into our car and we drove 2.5 hours over the mountains to Las Vegas on the day that the mayor and the city council were going to vote on the community rights ordinance. The room was packed. There was this feeling of excitement in the air. A buzz was going on. And we sat there and we watched them deliberate, and sure enough, when it came time to vote on that, they voted in favor of it. And cheers broke out from like 100 people crammed into this little room. And we looked at each other and we said, I think we're seeing a revolution happen. And that is exactly what we were seeing with community rights. Community rights upend the legal structure that we've come to know in the United States. And it's a really important shift that's going on, because we can't continue to have the same power holders in charge that have been in charge for the past 400, 500 years. As the previous speaker was saying so articulately, that worldview came out of trying to preserve their right to go to other places, take over the land, conquest and colonize that land, and then extract its resources for the wealth of the very few. And if we want to see something different in the United States, we need to be willing to be revolutionary in our thinking. We need to be profoundly respectful of the fact that those of us who are not indigenous to this land have been part of the problems on this land. And that if we want to find solutions to these problems, we need to take more responsibility for the ways that our cities and our towns, our states and our federal government, and yes, the corporations as well, have been acting and behaving in this world. The good news about it is that we can do such things, and community rights is leading the way in how we take back people power instead of corporations having power. As we know, corporations are not people, no matter what the legal fashion of the day is. And we need to always remember that if we're talking about democracy, we're not talking about a few people having all the power. Democracy is a really broad, deep word. It goes a lot bigger and broader than just voting once a year for the politicians who are going to make all the decisions. It's a word that means, how do we as ordinary people figure out solutions to the problems that we face? How do we take care of people, take care of planet? And if that's not what your democracy means to you, you need to dig deeper into that word, democracy. You need to think about, what does it mean for people to sort out their problems together? And what does it mean to have that kind of trust in ordinary people? Now, there's a kind of a mythology going on out there in the world that, if you listen to the corporate news, they want us to believe that people are incompetent, that we're cruel and thoughtless, that all we do is hurt one another, that all we do is want to get ahead for ourselves, that all we want is just money and goods and stuff. But that's not the real story of what people are like. People all over the country and indeed around the world, they want to take care of their families, but they also want connection and belonging, community. They also want to live in a place that's safe and is healthy. And if they need to step up to make wiser decisions that are being shown by those who think they hold the power now, then it's time to start listening very deeply and seeing if maybe your friends and neighbors are more worthy of your trust than corporations and corporate politicians. So I'm going to be taking questions from the chat box throughout this whole hour. So if you have questions for me, go ahead and put them in the chat box. Maybe I say something provocative or thought-provoking, and you want to follow up with that. Go ahead and ask a question. I'll give you my 2 cents on it. Also, another thing that you can do is think, I'm looking at the live stream channel right now over on Twitch, and I'm noticing that like 122,000 people are over there playing Grand Theft Auto on one of the channels. And there's about 14 of us listening to this live stream right now. Well, I think there should be 140,000 people listening to this live stream and learning more about community rights and seeing things kind of like why we need to overturn the doctrine of domination, as our previous speaker said. So if you can give this a shout out on your other social media channels or invite your friends to come and listen to the live stream, that's a great way to help the movement for community rights reach another person, reach another set of audience. Give it a little shout out. So when I started writing the Dandelion Insurrection, I had just come off of that experience watching a revolution happen in Las Vegas. And indeed, not too long after that, Mora County passed their community rights ordinance as well. And even though there's a long back and forth to what happened in Mora, but even though they eventually had to repeal that community rights ordinance and pass another kind of an ordinance, because of their choice to take a bold stand against fracking, to be willing to overturn the way that we orient with laws, they still don't have any frackers in Mora County. That entire watershed is still protected from fracking and the toxins. The water that is such a precious resource in New Mexico has not been pumped out of the earth by the thousands and millions of gallons to extract a fracked natural gas, so-called natural gas, that then is going to destroy our climate and leave us with an unlivable planet. So, fresh off of that experience, I was sitting around working on this novel, The Dandelion Insurrection, and my big question with this book was, what if the corporations were really in control? Now, this was 7-8 years ago, and I had a suspicion. We were coming off of the Occupy movement. A lot of people were talking about corporate power, and I said, what if we started thinking about this as like a corporate dictatorship? And let's call it a hidden corporate dictatorship, simply because most of our friends and neighbors, relatives, colleagues, they don't think that the corporations are in charge, right? They think the corporations maybe have too much power in terms of they don't get held accountable, but they really aren't thinking about what's really going on in our public policy. In 2016, a pair of researchers at Princeton University called Gillens and Page started to research federal level public policy issues And they looked at 2,000 bills that went through Congress in a 20-year period. So, in that 20 years, you have Republican presidents and Democratic Congresses, you have Democratic presidents and Republican Congresses, you have Democratic, Republican, etc. You can break it down by the House and the Senate, whatever configuration. What they found was that on 2,000 public policy issues, we, the people, got our way a whopping 0.0% of the time. That's actually the statistical number they quote in the study. 0.0% of the time, unless corporations or rich people happen to back the bill as well. But if we, the people, didn't have the backing of one of those two groups, we never got any of our issues through Congress. This means that we do not have a democracy. We can call it an oligarchy, we can call it a plutocracy, we can call it a corporatocracy, but one thing we can't call it is a democracy. So, thinking about this, I wanted to posit this hidden corporate dictatorship, right? And, being the rather well-intentioned and naive younger activist than I am, more naive than I am now, I started writing this story about what would happen if ordinary people rose up to throw off the yoke of corporate power. And when I first started writing, I'll confess I got my characters into a lot of trouble, and then I didn't know how to get them out of trouble. I didn't know about nonviolent action. I didn't really know about all the ways that people are resisting corporate power. So I did what any millennial would do, and I actually Googled it, how to bring down dictators nonviolently. Because I thought maybe we have enough violence in the world, and maybe we're a little outgunned when it comes to using violence. So I thought maybe I get 1 or 2 hits back. But actually, what came back was thousands, maybe millions of hits on people who have used nonviolent action to bring down dictatorships all over the world. I mean, literally, my entire growing up experience in the late 80s, late to late 90s was marked by one group of people after another throwing dictators out of power using nonviolent struggle. And what I found was that I would learn this later on after writing the book. Another study had come out by a pair of women named Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen. And they actually compared 326 case studies of violent and nonviolent campaigns. And what they found was that in issues where people were trying to have a change of government, where they were trying to end an occupation, where they were trying to repel a foreign invasion, things like that, nonviolent action was not only working, it was working twice as often as violence, in a third of the amount of time, and with 1/10 of the casualties. So this is like hold the presses, stop the presses. Maybe we're thinking about how to wage liberational struggles all wrong. Maybe we're actually choosing the very tools that our oppressors know how to beat us at, i.e. using violence. And maybe this nonviolent action thing is actually a lot more powerful than we think. So as I was writing the novel, I started reading all these things that came back on the internet. And I really got into the study of nonviolent action and nonviolent struggle. And I started to weave it into the book. And I came to a point where I had read about how, you can use strikes and blockades and boycotts and occupations and shutdowns and sit-ins and, civil disobedience. And I could go on. There's over 300 different methods of nonviolent action. And you can use those to say no, to say this has to stop, this pipeline can't come in, this clear cutting has to halt, this fracking project can't proceed. But you also have to say yes. You have to say yes to something else. And the more deeply you can dig into the problem that you're facing and get to the bottom of why you got into this mess to begin with, the more you can find a solution like community rights that is really going to upend the ways that we think about how we're in the world. Stephen Newcomb in the previous live stream was just talking about the doctrine of domination. Most of us have known it as the doctrine of discovery, and how it's not just it's a doctrine, right? It's a brainwashing thing. It says that we, people of European descent, have a right to go and take land, take resources, take over. This is the kind of mentality that we need to upend in U.S. society. And another mentality is expecting a hierarchy of command to know the best answers right up the totem pole. That's a bad reference. Right up the hierarchy of who is the most powerful person, the perceived most powerful person. And what the reality is that ordinary people have extraordinary answers to their problems. Ordinary people have a really clear sense of, you know what, putting chemicals in our air, in our water, putting a CAFO farm upstream from everybody else is not going to work out well for ourselves, our children, their children. And so community rights are really a way to put power back in people's hands. And it is very, very revolutionary in the best sense of that word. And I really was so impressed by the ways that people from Pennsylvania to New Mexico to Colorado to even places further abroad around the world were using the community rights to do things that all the most powerful people in the world couldn't seem to get their acts together to do. That I thought, I need to put community rights into my novels because hopefully people are going to read these books. Hopefully they're going to be enjoyable. Hopefully people are going to be plugging along the ride of this really feisty, indomitable movement of people rising up against corporate dictatorship and run into a character whose town in Pennsylvania passed a community rights ordinance and is now defending their town with nonviolent action against frackers who want to violate those laws. One of the interesting things in the Mora County Community Bill of Rights, and indeed many of the community rights ordinances now are incorporating these, is exempting police from enforcing laws when movements of local people rise up to assert their right to these community rights using nonviolent struggle. And as an activist, I always thought that was really a fascinating thing to add into our legal structure. That right now we have 81 bills, anti-protest bills, in states all over the country. A lot of them came about after the George Floyd protests. They are racist kickback to people rising up for racial justice. And some of them are a little bit older in their legacy. Some of them started really ramping up after Standing Rock. Again, racist kickback to indigenous people rising up to defend their land from people who want to destroy it and pollute it. So, as someone who now really thinks a lot about strategy for nonviolent movements, who actually trains people nationwide in how we can be strategic, and is watching these anti-protest bills get introduced into one legislature after another, I really think it's fascinating that, the community rights are trying to assert that we have a right to use the tools of nonviolent struggle to uphold the laws that we see as just. And, I would love to see that work expanded. I would love us to stop really trying to protect our Second Amendment exclusively and maybe give a little focus on the First Amendment and maybe even put in a Bill of Rights of nonviolent struggle. That if we, the people, want to assert what kind of people we want to be, what kind of society we want to be with things like boycotts and strikes and blockades, etc., then that's totally fine in our culture. That is permitted, that is accepted, that is legal, that is our right. These are the kinds of revolutionary thinking I think people who have been following the community rights movement for a long time have really been grappling with. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about, because although I wrote about rights of nature really briefly in the Dandelion Insurrection, it's actually a trilogy. And when I went to write the third book, Winds of Change, I actually started to write a lot about why we need to upend our thinking around nature as a commodity, as an object, and instead kind of flip the script on that and say rivers should have rights, right? Inalienable rights of existence that may include not being polluted, right? That a mountain should have rights, which include not being blown up and dismembered so that somebody can extract coal. I think these kind of rights are long overdue in the conversation that the United States specifically has been having. And many of you probably know that some of the history of the United States has been one long continuous journey to protect the rights of rich people and corporations over the rights of many different other groups of people: women, African Americans, certainly indigenous people, and the earth itself. So what is the work that we have to do in this era to, honor that seed of an idea that all people should be created equal? It's not a bad idea, right? It's actually a pretty worthy notion, although the way it was implemented in 1787 was really, it fell short of the mark. It was like some people had those rights and everybody else didn't. In fact, 96% of us did not. So, the history of movements in the U.S. have been people standing up to get their inclusion and their rights. So I'm going to take a little breath of air here, and I'm going to check your chat box comment. There's so many great things coming in, I don't want to miss them. All right, we see community rights activism has been going on since 1999. Why do you think that there are still few people who know about it? Probably because we need to go and tweet and Facebook post this live stream link so they can come listen, right? I'll give another answer after that too. Initially we thought that the community rights movement would be more well known, but soon discovered that even amongst activist friends or those sympathetic, it wasn't getting the attention that it deserved. Why do you think this is? Oh, such a good question. So many thoughts on that. So one of the things that I notice in, not in activist communities so much, but in people in communities who are wanting to see change, is that we have a tendency, and I think it maybe comes out of the era where people did get some rather large progressive goals through federal government. So the EPA, the Clean Air Water Act, Clean Air Act, these are significant victories. They were really important victories, and they did indeed come through the federal power structure. But I do think that those successes are in the back of people's minds, and they're too willing to think that if we just shout loud enough, change will happen. If we just get 1 million people in the street, then the politicians will do the right thing. But what we know from the history of movements is that that's not actually the end-all be-all of the story. That usually movement groups need to withdraw cooperation and actually non-cooperate with injustice, disrupt daily affairs, raise the cost of continuing the injustice so that the person perpetrating the injustice has to think twice about what they're doing. Or actually, ideally, we organize such robust movements that the injustice simply cannot continue. It can't gain access to the resources like water and pipelines and construction equipments and funding from banks. And So by removing these sources of support, this is actually how movements win. This is how we get power holders to either make concessions or to lose the struggle to us. So how this relates to community rights, I think people have too much trust in the representative republic as they see it. They think that it's going to represent them. They think that it's going to work. But that study I mentioned at the beginning, with the Gillens-Page study, it's also called the Princeton Oligarchy Study. If you want to search for it, some great articles come up, the study comes up. That shows that actually this is not working for us. Our system of government does not serve ordinary people. And indeed, when we see changes, it is because people take extraordinary action, like passing a community rights ordinance and going through the legal challenges of that, or using nonviolent struggle to non-cooperate with the power holders. So I think people who are a little bought into the system, even if they're maybe not thinking of it that way, are a little too comfortable with it. They just keep expecting it to work, even though maybe even their experience shows that it's not going to work. I think the other reason that some people are actually scared of democracy, right? They think, well, and I'll confess, the first time I heard about community rights, this is the thought that came to my mind was, well, that's great. I know that I would do the right thing with community rights, but what about a town that's full of the alt-right? What about a town that's like, wants to use community rights to reinstate the KKK, right? So I want to just say that was my first impression, but what I've really learned over the years is that I need to have more faith in people, and I need to have more faith in processes of discourse, dialogue, deliberation, and indeed real democracy. Because one of the reasons that we have such deep distrust of one another is because we don't live in a democracy. We live in a conquest culture where right and left are fed a bunch of lies like the Hatfield and McCoys and geared up to go and fight each other until one conquers the other and subdues it for the moment. And when you're talking about community rights, when you're talking about real democracy, when you're talking about rewiring our whole society and really thinking revolutionary, you need to challenge that fear and suspicion. The idea that we have all the right answers and they have all the wrong answers. And dare to say, what kind of answers would my community come up with if they were actually given responsibility, information, knowledge, and a process that was respectful to them and us? And what we find from studying real democracy, participatory democracy, direct democracy, there's a lot of words for it, is that not only do people make fairly wise decisions, and there are ways to help people make wise decisions too. It's not just throw them into the ring and hope they do the right thing. So not only do they make decisions that are healthy for their community, but they also start to dismantle some of the fears and animosities that have been put in place to keep us divided and conquered. So those who are in power can continue to, pillage, plunder, extract, destroy, exploit. So to me, in my mind, it's all connected. And one of the things I love about community rights is that actually community rights, it challenges us to really think about what responsibility looks like in our communities. What does trust look like in our communities? What does it mean to no longer have somebody else to blame when things go wrong, but to be able to engage with ourselves and our communities in a meaningful way towards the goal of healthier people, healthier planet, more justice, more equity, more respect, more everything that human beings actually pretty across the board genuinely want and desire. We may have different strategies about how to get there, but we genuinely, almost all of us share these longings, and we've been longing for them for a long time. So, I just want to take another glimpse at this chat box. I see you guys are really chiming in. While I do that, here's what you guys can do. This is a fundraiser, right? You can go and make a donation. It could be $1, it could be $5, it could be a lot more. Every successful movement, particularly the more revolutionary you get, has always had people like you who have believed in the movement and who have given the movement the resources it needs to succeed. Everybody knows about the Montgomery bus boycott. Everybody knows about Rosa Parks doing her civil disobedience. And by the way, she said, there's this kind of story that she just got tired and didn't want to get up. But she later said, later in life, that the only tired I was tired of giving in. So just think about that. So everyone knows about Rosa Parks. Everybody knows about Dr. King. He actually got his start in the Montgomery bus boycott. He was headhunted by local leaders as someone who was new on the scene. They wanted a new, fresh voice because they had so many internal conflicts. But the people we don't hear enough about in the Montgomery bus boycott who made that campaign a success are the bake sale ladies. Yes, bake sale ladies. There were 2 committees of women, black women, who every week would put on a bake sale. So 2 bake sales per week. And all the proceeds of that bake sale would go to support the bus boycott. Because when they started to organize people to share rides together, the city of Montgomery said, no way, this is a taxi service and you need to get licensed and that's going to cost you a lot of money and you're going to need to pay the fees. So the bake sale ladies raised the funds to pay the fees and they could get their taxi service going. And that was what helped them continue the struggle for the 9 months to a full year that it took them to succeed. So I always say, if you can't be Rosa Parks, and not all of us can do civil disobedience, if you can't be Dr. King, and not all of us are like the people who want to give the public speeches, right? Then be the bake sale ladies. Because without them, you wouldn't have had those buses desegregated. So without you, and without donors like you and people supporting the community rights movement, how are we going to get to that next town that needs to hear about us but hasn't? How are we going to pay for the travel costs for people who need to go and work with communities one-on-one, person to person? How are you going to do the back-end management to help the staff on this organization that are so amazing keep doing their amazing work? So think about what you might spend at a bake sale and maybe drop that in the pot for people today. All right, I see your questions and comments coming in. What are some of the best strategies, nonviolent strategies, that facilitate long-lasting change? Great question. So I love this question. I could talk about it all day, every day, for the rest of my life, because I think the one thing our movements are seriously short on is understanding how strategy for nonviolent change works. And it's less about one tactic versus another, and more about understanding ecosystems, let's say, or systems theory. And that may sound a little esoteric, but it's really not. Here's how we can think about it. Let's take fracking, for example. And actually, it's a great example because it actually shows up in this book. It's a little strategy moment. So frackers can't frack our communities without a whole lot of resources. They need permits. They need legal structure behind them, and that's where community rights is really kicking out that pillar of support for them. Community rights are really saying, we're just going to take your legal right away, and you can't come in until you figure that out. But they also need pipes, they need water, they need workers, they need funding. And all of these are what we call the pillars of support, right? So these are the pillars. They prop up the problem or the injustice. And we can say this is the fracking. And if any of those pillars aren't sturdy, if we take away the legal thing through community rights, if we take away the water, if we take away their access to the pipes, if we block the construction, then this isn't as sturdy as it used to be, and it's going to fall. And it's not going to be able to continue down its devastating path. So that's the first thing you need to know about nonviolent strategies, is they don't work exclusively because we just shouted loud enough. They work because we withdraw our resources. We non-cooperate with the injustice. We intervene. We get in the way of injustice. So think about that a little bit. How can you block the resources that the problem needs? Also, how can you pair tactics? So, don't just march, don't just protest. Figure out if you can boycott or get a divestment campaign going. These tools are really effective. They're really powerful, but they need to be used powerfully, right? If you're going to take a screwdriver and try to hammer a nail into the wall with it, it's not going to work that well. If you're going to try to use a saw to glue two pieces of wood together, it's not going to work, right? So you need to know what the tools are, and you need to use them appropriately. Let's see, I'm just going to check. I think there was another... Yeah, we have some chat up above about inverted totalitarianism. I wish I had known that word when I was writing the Dandelion instruction. I only learned about it afterwards. I think it's, it sounds like a mouthful, inverted totalitarianism. But when you really get it, you're like, wow, that's really Orwellian. So inverted totalitarianism is when you don't need an external totalitarian to keep everybody in line, because we ourselves have internalized the ideologies and the beliefs so much that we're keeping each other in line. That's like one aspect of it. But it's really apropos when we're talking about community rights. And one of the reasons is because, an example of inverted totalitarianism is, just assuming that the legal structure that we have is the best on earth because we are the best nation on earth, right? And not having the radical humility to say, how could we do this better? How could we do laws in a better way that create more respect for human beings, that help us live in respectful alignment with the earth, and in this day and age, even help us account for the harms and injustices that have gotten us to this state and this point in time, right? So we have a backlog of wrongs that have been done. And if we're going to figure out how we're going to move forward, we need to be really bold in acknowledging those and thinking about how we're going to organize our society to account for those, to make right what has been wrong in the past. To not just imagine that we're going to wipe a slate clean and have some beautiful revolutionary utopia. Because that's not how the world works. In fact, that's very much part of the problem, how we got into this mess. Right? So terra nullius, which our previous speaker, Stephen Newcomb, knows that word all too well. The illusion of empty land, terra nullius, nothing there, is a lie. It was a mythology invented to excuse colonialism. So we can't keep that mentality around. We can't just pretend we're going to wipe a slate clean and then just have a perfect life if we just, get our acts together. We have to embrace the work that we have to do. And we have to see it as part of these times. So I'm going to invite you to put any questions or comments in the chat box at this moment. We have a few more minutes, and I'd love to make sure that I get a chance to answer them. Taos, New Mexico has not passed a community rights ordinance yet. One of the reasons is because they feel like they got it handled, right? But the reality is they have a lot of things they could think about using a community rights ordinance for. They have a lot of struggles, a lot of things that go down in this community that aren't in alignment even with the majority of the people in the town. And, one of the things I love about community rights is that they ask us to question deeply who we are, who we want to be, what our communities want to be. And yes, we often turn to them when we're in a crisis, when we have no other options to stop something that is so devastating that we cannot fathom it happening. And that is a superpower of community rights. They're there for us when we really need them. But the reality is that we don't have to wait for a crisis to start working on our community rights. We can also look forward. We can be visionary. We can be really proactive in introducing these concepts to our community so that if a problem arrives on our doorstep, we are ready to respond. This is like the basis of defense, and military people actually talk about it all the time. But nonviolent struggle people don't necessarily talk about it enough, and certainly are progressive or radical. I'm a radical, not really a progressive, but we aren't thinking about preparing a good defense so that we're ready when things happen. We're often behind the curve, right? We're like 500 years behind the curve right now. But I think I would love to see our communities really working on real participatory democracy, thinking deeply about what makes community rights effective and what helps our communities use them wisely for the benefit of people and planet. I would love to see us training in nonviolent struggle on an ongoing basis through all sectors of our society, so that when a worker group needs to go on strike, they're not like, how do we do that? They're like, yeah, let's do it. When the students feel like they need to get the name of their school changed from a racist Confederate name, they're not like, what do we do? They're like, we know how to get this done. There's a lot of countries around, not a lot, there's a handful of countries around the world who are thinking about this. They call it civilian-based defense. And it's a kind of nonviolent struggle. And actually, I've heard this word come up around the community rights ordinances as well. Thinking about if an aggressor or a dominator or something destructive comes into our town, who in our community is ready to resist, and what can they do? When I wrote the scene in the Dandelion Insurrection with the community rights ordinance, I tried to imagine what every person in that town could do to resist the frackers coming in violation of their community rights. So, we had everything from a file clerk in the county offices losing the paperwork for like weeks, right, to citizens pointing down the wrong road when the trucks rumbled in, to people filling in ditches or digging ditches in the way on their private roads that the frackers are trying to get down. What are all the things that people can do, and how can you prepare them to do those things when and if they need to be called upon to protect and defend with nonviolent action their homes, their communities, and their right to protect their families and the earth? When you are a novelist, you get to sit around and think about all these kind of scenarios. But the funny thing is, when you are in a movement, you also have the right to sit around and think about all these things. So thank you to the person who just donated. I really appreciate that. If you're sitting out there kind of waffling on the fence and being like, oh, when should I donate? Why don't you donate now? And then if you get inspired again, donate again. Most of us have, some form of a Netflix account. Some of us have movie rentals. Like, we all spend money on things that are right up the corporate alley. Today, maybe let's eschew one of those and put it in the community rights pot. It'll certainly go a lot further towards helping our communities, helping our families, helping the earth, and helping to have real democracy in the United States. So I see one more question in the chat box here. What organizing are you up to right now? That is a great, great question. I can answer it for like an hour and a half, and I think I won't give you the long answer. Because one of the privileges of my work is that I get to work with many, many different groups. So I get to help train people who are doing water protection. I get to help communities who are working to stop fracking. I'm working with a campaign to stop the expansion of the U.S. military draft to women, but instead abolish the military draft, which is forced conscription, which is basically another form of slavery, to all people. I'm working with young people to help them know how nonviolent struggle works, so as they're doing climate action, they know how to be effective. So that's a really short answer to a long question. So the other question I see in the chat box is, how can I get my progressive activist friends to embrace the CR concept? Great question. You should ask Paul that question too. I'm sure he has a really good answer for that, born from his experience and the experience of other organizers in introducing these concepts into communities. But what I've seen firsthand is that even our progressive friends know in their hearts that something's not working, something's not right. They may be feeling, if it's not an election year, they may be feeling a little demoralized, right? They're like, why can't we get this stuff done? They may feel like there might be a more effective way to go about things, but they're not quite sure. So I think being bold enough to go and start to introduce the concepts and to really talk about, what helped me was really learning the long arc of history about why we don't have community rights. And then also learning that actually people around the world are working to rewire democracy, that there is a very large participatory democracy movement afoot globally. And that maybe we want to be on the front of this curve. So those are a couple thoughts that come to me right now, but I'd be really curious how other people would answer that question, and maybe if you have an answer, you could share it in the chat with folks. Honestly, one of the ways that I try to subvert all my wonderful friends who are not quite as radical as me is actually by writing these novels, because I really believe that a good story is a really great way to kind of infuse an idea into people's thought process in a way that isn't maybe right in their face. They don't have to make a decision about it right now, but when the day comes that community rights comes to their town, they'll be like, oh, didn't I read about that in that Dandelion book? So I'm happy to report that actually I am getting a growing readership for this book, and there's thousands of readers out there. So I like to think of it, every time someone actually gets my book, I'm out there promoting community rights in that one chapter on page 125. And so thank you all for doing the real on the ground work, which is honestly a lot harder than writing a novel about it. But it's people like you who give me hope, who give me my best ideas for characters, who inspire me so deeply that I feel I'm not doing my job in the world if I don't include you in my fiction. So thank you so much, so much for having the vision and the courage and the persistence to go to one community after another and say, you could do this. It's okay to be revolutionary. In fact, it's necessary to be revolutionary. I think a lot about Thomas Paine, who was, in terms of that revolution, he was where it was at. He was radical, he was just, he was a little bit crazy. He took every penny he ever got from common sense and he gave it right back to the movement. He printed a lot of his stuff on underground printers because the British cracked down on printing. And he was in a real tiff with the so-called founding fathers over their decision to permit slavery. And he died a penniless pauper, and, with just a couple freed slaves at his funeral. So I think about that, about what that means to be a revolutionary in these times, and what courage it takes, and how it requires us to tell a different story about ourselves and about the times that we live in. And I like to tell people that, we're not living in times that are a boring story, let's say. If our lives were a novel, this would not be a boring time to be alive. In fact, it would be a very epic time to be alive. It would be a massive adventure. It would be like Lord of the Rings scale and scope of existential crisis, right? We can literally end the world in so many ways. It's make or break time for humanity. We are at the crossroads. And what we need to live in such times is to think of ourselves inside of a story that is more comparable to the Lord of the Rings than to like Dick and Jane got up and had breakfast. We're not going to have the houses and the little white picket fence and the dog and Susie and Jane for kids. We're going to have uncertainty. We're going to have adventure. But you know what's going to make it all worthwhile? Is good friends, brave people, colleagues like yourselves, people like the community rights organization who are out there saying, let's do something so crazy, it's exactly what these times need. That's what makes living in a story like this worth it. That's what makes it exciting. That's what makes me willing to get up day after day and fight the good fight. Speak about nonviolent action. Reach out to that next person. Get up when I get knocked down. And for me, it's people like yourselves who give me hope in the world. People are willing to think differently about who we are and what we need to do. People who are willing to work towards that goal. People who are willing to be curious and humble. People who are willing to move from their hearts. People who are willing to think with their heads, to think strategically. And people who are willing to keep their eye on what's possible and bring that possibility 1 inch closer to our reality. So, if you like those kind of people too, thank yourself for being one of them. And consider, how you can support the community rights organization today. Maybe it is by making a donation. Some of us have resources that we can share in that way. Maybe the resource you have that you can share is taking the link to this and telling a friend about it, so that they can tap into the great music and arts, conversation and information that's going to be shared today and tomorrow. We all have something we can give to the movement, and many of you I know have already been giving a lot to the movement, so thank you for that. It's a real honor for me to be here with you all today, and I just thank you for inviting me, and keep up your great work. Keep your hearts strong, keep your spirits bright, and know that there are so many people out there rooting for you, even if they don't know about you yet. In their hearts, they want what you already know is possible. And all we have to do is get that story to them. So thank you. As we say in the Dandelion Insurrection, if you want to do something truly radical, be kind, be connected, be unafraid. Thank you.